Hi there. This video is going to be going over the second part of Chapter 2, Section 2, where we cover sort of a assortment of different groups that came to power in Mesopotamia after the Babylonians. The first of these groups is the Hittites, which we should remember from the Lost Cities Hattusha video. In fact, on this map, you can see with that black dot where Hattusha was. Now, you might be wondering why we call the Hittites, who are clearly located here in modern-day Turkey in Asia Minor, a Mesopotamian civilization when they're not really between the Tigris and the Euphrates. But it's important because these guys did extend their empire down into the Mesopotamian world. And their culture was very heavily influenced by and influenced everything that was going on in the Mesopotamian world proper as well. So you might ask, why are these guys listed as Mesopotamians? It's because they extended down to and were influenced by the Mesopotamians as well. But the Hittites, this is where their empire basically was located. Now, as far as what we know about them, they were an Indo-European people, which tells us a little bit of something about their language. And we know that they came into Asia Minor, they came into Mesopotamia from Asia Minor around 1400 BC. The main thing that our textbook tells us about them, sort of the most important thing that our textbook tells us about them, is that these guys were famous because they were the first group to really figure out how to extract iron from iron ore. And you might say, well, what's the big deal about this, using iron? Big whoop. But you have to remember, iron was a very useful material to be making your tools out of, compared to, say, the copper and bronze that you might have seen before. And so iron is going to be stronger, tougher, and allow for better tools, which is going to be more effective in your civilization. So this is a big deal, because originally the only source of iron that we had in the world was pure iron that was found kind of ready-made from meteorites that fell to Earth without having to be extracted from iron ore. And you might say, well, how much of this was there? And the answer is not much. It was a luxury item. It was super rare to find this kind of iron. And it meant that around the 19th century BC, iron was valued at 40 times its weight in silver because it was so rare. The funny thing is, though, that there's iron everywhere. Iron is basically 5% of the Earth's crust, which might not seem like a lot number-wise, just percent-wise, but it means that it's all over the place. It can very easily be found compared to other metals like copper or tin. And it means, like I said, that you can make stronger weapons, better tools for less money. But the problem is we couldn't access it. We couldn't actually use this iron ore, because even if you pull it out of the ground, this iron ore is combined with or mixed with other elements, things like sulfur and oxygen, which make it harder to work with. You need to get this thing removed from all the other stuff that it could be mixed up with. I always use the analogy from Minecraft, where, yes, you can dig up the iron ore from the ground, but you have to heat it up. You've got to smelt it to actually make it usable, just like in Minecraft. Well, the first people to figure out how to do this, how to get that iron out of the ground and smelt it and purify it, even to a temperature of 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, as we see here, were the Hittites. So in addition to all that stuff we saw in the Hattusha video about their warfare and their chariots and all that stuff, this seems to be the thing that they are most well known for, is being the iron guys. And they kept this ironworking strategy a secret. They really tried to keep this technology secret, because once everybody else knows how to make iron, everybody else has the same advantage that you have, which means that nobody has an advantage. So one of the reasons why the Hittites were so successful was that their technology, the ironworking technology, allowed them to be. But this did not, stay secret for long. Eventually, word started to get out. For instance, in the very first peace treaty ever in history, which was between the Egyptians and the Hittites after the Battle of Kadesh, which was the battle that we heard about in the Hattusha video, ironworking, or iron, was part of that treaty. And we're going to see ways that this ironworking gets let out again elsewhere too. The Hittites are also known for establishing potentially the first constitutional monarchy. That is, a monarchy where a king or queen has certain limits placed on them to stop them from overreaching and overusing their power. This might not seem like such a surprising thing nowadays. We've had constitutional monarchies for a while. But if the Hittites are the first, then that is a big deal. The way we saw it with the Hittites is that their king was overseen by a court of guys called the Pankus. The Hittites did not stick around forever, though. You notice that their start date is around 1400 BC, and then their end date is 1200 BC. So they only really had about 200 years of kind of running things in the Mesopotamian world. And we know, again, we saw it in the video, that there was a lot of political infighting that led to the downfall of Hittite civilization. They started bickering with one another politically. This fall of their empire led to the spreading out of the remnants of the Hittites. And as they spread throughout the world, they took their ironworking technology with them. So a lot of people believe that the Iron Age spread throughout the world as Hittite ironsmiths literally spread throughout the world in the wake of the destruction of their big cities and their empire. I have an image here of a war chariot, a Hittite war chariot. We talked a little bit about this in person. You can see the image there. The next group we're going to talk about are the Assyrians. Okay, you can see the relative location of the Assyrians here on the map. Smack dab in Mesopotamia, you can see their big city, Nineveh, listed there. Here's another image of the Assyrians, a little bit more zoomed in. And again, you can see some of the key cities here, as well as some of our old friends like Babylon and Ur from other cities or other cultures. So the Assyrians are a group that settled in the upper part of Mesopotamia, the upper area of the Tigris River. This meant that it was a little bit more moderate in terms of its climate, not as unpredictable with its flooding. And as a result, the soil was a little less rich, a little less fertile, but not having to deal with the crazy unpredictable flooding that the Sumerians had was a bit of a good trade-off here. Much of what we know about these guys points to the fact that their culture was very similar to that of the Babylonians, Hammurabi's people, whose territory they took over after Hammurabi fell. We know a lot about their society. Some of the more interesting things are that they had 3 levels of society. You sort of free landowners, farmers and merchants, and then enslaved people. We know that they had no sort of distinctions between immigrants or natives, which might not seem like a big deal, but the idea of an ancient culture treating immigrants as equals to native-born people of that culture is very rare. In ancient Greece, for instance, if you leave your home city to go live in another city, you are never treated as an equal to somebody who lives in that home city. Being an immigrant to a new place is sort of like a down step as far as your status goes. But in the Assyrian world, that was not the case, and that's kind of unique and interesting. We know that they took a lot of the science and technology and knowledge from the earlier Mesopotamians and added to it. So just like the Sumerians were doing things like math and astronomy, the Assyrians were doing the same thing. And they built a lot of trade routes, especially heading towards the sea, which makes sense when you look at their placement. You can see they're kind of farther away from everybody. They're farther from the rivers and they're farther from the sea, so they got to make a definite effort to get out that way. If you have to remember one thing about these guys, it's the fact that they were the military powerhouse of the Mesopotamian world. All of the cultures that we talk about had militaries, but these guys were particularly good. They were thought to be some of the most feared warriors in history. And not just because they were good at warfare, but also because everything in their lives was dedicated to warfare. Their religion was based on warfare. Their politics were based on warfare. Everything was based on warfare, being at war constantly to please their gods all the time. So if you have to remember anything about the Assyrians, it's that they were the ultra-military guys. And that war, of course, meant that you needed to have a really good army, and they did. They had a gigantic army with specialty units and spy networks and strong organization. That army was used very effectively and very strongly. They didn't just conquer a place and then leave it be. They conquered a place and then terrorized it, or used the army to enact mass deportations of people. So they really were ruthless with that army. But what a lot of people don't remember is why they got that way in the first place, why they developed a culture that was so focused on military stuff. And it all goes back to geography. You'll remember that Mesopotamia has very few natural barriers. There's a lot of, it makes it very easy for people to invade you if they want to. And because the Assyrian homeland was situated on such a sort of prime piece of real estate, they had a lot of people come in that were trying to take them over and attack them. And so the Assyrians decided, let's make an amazing military. That was sort of the key driver of their society. And of course, once you've got that good military, you got to figure out ways to use it. And that's where the empire comes in and the terror tactics and all that stuff. So geography led to them choosing a military lifestyle because they were constantly getting invaded because they were on a good piece of geography with no natural barriers. So they needed to do something about that. Their government was a very sort of simple affair. You can imagine that a military culture, a military society is going to have a pretty straightforward top-down chain of command. They really didn't care about like sort of winning the hearts and minds of the people that they conquered. They just controlled them. They would put their own people in charge of the places they controlled so that they didn't, have to worry about some upstart governor running this newly conquered territory trying to rebel against you. The king was thought to be the center of the universe, chosen by the gods to act as their representative, which basically sounds like everything we saw in other cultures in Mesopotamia. This sounds a lot like what you see in, Sumeria and Babylon. It's nothing surprising here. The main thing that's unique about them, though, is that their main job was the military job. Their primary role is the military, controlling the military. But of course, they're the king, and so they control everything too. Everybody's responsible for the king. Everybody keeps tabs on each other and reports back to the king. There's a lot of propaganda that's used to show how great the king is, such as the lion hunting reliefs that we looked at in class, or we will look at in class. And basically, it's your standard sort of very strong monarchy system. Although it's interesting, we do see some extensive laws about how the royal family has to live. In fact, they might be the first government with extensive laws showing this type of control over how the people of the royal family live. They can't just do whatever they want. They have to live a certain way. For instance, we see that women had certain rules about how they had to live. Now, interestingly, the Assyrians are responsible for inventing libraries, which might be hard to understand when you think about them as the military guys. You think, wait a minute, library guys versus, warfare guys does not seem to match up. But it all comes down to the fact that books, and by books here, we're not talking about actual books. We're talking about like tablets, stone tablets with cuneiform on them, or clay tablets with cuneiform on them. But in this case, these tablets are basically another type of treasure that you can take when you attack a city. We know that the Assyrians were attacking lots of places, and they were stealing all sorts of treasures there. But writing, tablets, books, are also a form of treasure that you can steal from people once you've conquered their city. And of course, you want to keep all of that treasure safe. And so what do? Well, you drop it into a building specially made to hold all of this treasure. And this, of course, leads to the creation of the first libraries. These collections of texts taken from throughout the Mesopotamian world that were collected into a single location, sorted, divided up just the same way that we divide them up today in the library. You can go to different sections of the library for different subjects. And it's really interesting that these are the very first libraries. For instance, like the library at the Palace of Nineveh, created by King Ashurbanipal, which we see a recreation of on this slide. I love that this looks like a fortress more than a library, because if all of your treasures are stored in there, you don't want anybody coming in there to claim them. So very interesting, but not hard to see why libraries and warfare would go hand in hand here. Speaking of Ashurbanipal, here he is from the Mesopotamians music video, although his actual image might look something a little bit more like this. Here he is on horseback hunting lions. I have a lot of images of different Assyrian reliefs, these carvings half into the wall, and you can read about them here, but we look at them, or we will look at them in class a little bit. But basically, very interesting pieces of art that tell us a lot about what's going on in the Assyrian world and about their lion hunting proclivities. Okay, so we're also going to talk about the Neo-Babylonians. This is not the original Babylonians. This is another group of Babylonians, different Babylonians, the New Babylonians. They eventually fought for and gained their independence from the Assyrians who had conquered them, but they only lasted for a brief time. Only about 100 years or so. Their most famous ruler was a man named Nebuchadnezzar II. And if you have to know anything about the Neo-Babylonians, is that these guys were sort of the monument builders. They were famous for building these large construction projects. So Babylon, the city of Hammurabi, had been falling to pieces, and the Neo-Babylonians come to be, and they revived the city and rebuild all the infrastructure, including the temples and the palaces and the walls. They built a famous ziggurat called the Ziggurat of Marduk, which is a huge public temple project. And they're also potentially the people that built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, if you've heard of that wonder of the world. So these guys are the famous builders. They're also responsible for this, the Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate is a famous monument designed not just to act as a very impressive gate, but also to show a display of power by showing, creating this gigantic wall and gigantic gate, but then also decorating it beautifully with these images of the different gods that are represented on it. This is the kind of thing that the Neo-Babylonians did all the time, building these gigantic monuments. Some people think that the Ziggurat of Marduk may have even been the inspiration for the Tower of Babel, if you're familiar with that story from the Bible. There's a little bit of Persia discussed in our chapter here, although we are going to save Persia for another time. We'll talk about Persia when we talk about ancient Greece, and we may do some other activities specifically about Persia another time. But you can ignore Persia for the time being, and we'll come back to it. The final group to talk about is the Phoenicians. These guys are my favorites. I like the Phoenicians a lot. You can see they're a tiny little group just on the edge of the Mediterranean here, this one little sliver of purple that you see on this map here. But they also have all of this purple out here in the Mediterranean. And the reason why that is because they had a tiny little narrow strip of land along the Mediterranean coast, which was great, but you need more space. And so what they famously did was take advantage of their extensive trade networks, specifically their sea trade networks, to send out colonies. That is a territory that's settled and ruled by people from another land. So the Phoenicians, who have all of these trading capabilities, all these ships that they can sail around the Mediterranean with, but they need more space. So what they do is they sent people out into the Mediterranean, and they set up these colonies on the fringes of the Mediterranean, so that they could have more land and all the resources that came with being in that new place, but then they could still send things back and forth to each other by the sea. So these guys, because they're doing so much trade throughout the Mediterranean world, are sometimes called the carriers of civilization. They are famous for just spreading culture everywhere, because everyone they trade with is picking up stuff from all the people that they've traded with previously. They even got as far as Britain, where we know that they traded for tin. So these guys were really, putting in the effort to get all their merchant stuff done. They are most famous for creating this special purple dye that was used to color cloth and other things. This very rich, vibrant, reddish, purplish color. And it was interestingly made from snails. They had a special process that they would use to extract liquid from these snails and then turn that into this very, very expensive dye, because you can only get a couple of drops from each snail. So to get enough dye to actually color like a garment or a piece of a garment required a lot of effort. So these guys are famous for their purple dye made from snails, not the shells, but the actual snails themselves. They're also famous because they're the ones that spread the alphabet that we know and love. The alphabetic writing system, where each symbol represents a sound. This alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet, is the one that was adopted later by the Greeks. And then the Greeks took that alphabet and it spread to the Romans. And from the Romans, it spreads to us today. So this alphabetic system that we have, where each symbol represents a sound, as opposed to cuneiform, where each symbol represents a syllable, was created by the Phoenicians or adapted by the Phoenicians and then spread all over the world thanks to their cultural diffusion efforts. And that's it. That's the end of chapter 2. So we will end here. That'll do it for us for the Mesopotamian world. Thanks a lot, guys.